All right, we can start the afternoon session. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Robert van Rooij. He's a professor in logic and cognition, if I'm not mistaken, that's the official title. And well, today he will be talking about games and language. I think the focus is on evolutionary game theory mostly, but I guess we'll hear about that. Robert works at the Institute for Logic, Language and Computation in Amsterdam. And yeah, without further ado, I think you can start.
Okay, well, thank you. Sorry for that I have to use the microphone, which is not to my pleasure, but it has to be for the better purposes. So, okay, I will talk about games and language, and Michael Rovatzos asked me to actually do some more introductory stuff. So I will talk mostly actually about games, and only later say how you can actually apply that to language. Now I should say that there are two ways of thinking about how to apply game theory to language. And they have to do with the two ways of thinking about games. There's one way of thinking about games is in a rationalistic point of view, so that people are completely rational. And then what people have done, and among others me, is to use that type of game theory, so standard game theory, to apply for, rational people interacting with each other, and then applying that to account, for instance, for conversational implicatures. I might say something about that, but probably not. There's another way, and that is what I will concentrate on, is to say, okay, we have games, we can look at it from an evolutionary point of view, and we use that to understand, conventions of language. And so I will go into evolutionary game theory, so standard game theory, evolutionary game theory, and then how to use a particular type of game, signaling games, to look at that from an evolutionary point of view, and how can that be used to account for some linguistic conventions. So that's the idea. It will be more basic than the previous lecture, mostly because, I was asked to do that. So, okay, language and games. So, if you think about games, you're thinking about, you can understand games, okay, you can characterize games in different points of view. I said it already, you can think of games from an evolutionary point of view, but mostly it's done from a strategic point of view. So we think of an aesthetic point of view. So we think of a static game, that's the most simple game you can think of. That is just, formally, is a triple consisting of, let me see whether I get this. Doesn't it have a pointer? Doesn't it have a pointer? Is this? No. Anyway, so this N, that's the number of agents. You have a set of agents. Then for each agent, you have a set of actions or strategies that person can do. And you have the U, and that's just the utility given to, if the number of people do a certain action, what is then the utility for each person? So N is a set of players, I the actions available to player I, and UI is the player, or is the player's utility function. And the utility function, it said already, so if you look at what all players are doing, they're all playing a certain action, and then for each agent, the utility function says, okay, that is the utils or money or whatever, right, that person get. Okay, and so this is the set of actions that the first person until the last person is doing, so the nth persons, and that's called an action profile. Okay. Now it's not working. This. Oh yeah. By complete information, they know the structure of the game. So they know every player and knows the utility function of everybody and knows the actions that everybody can take. No, they don't know what action. No, that's the purpose. So the representation of a game is like that, right? So everybody knows each other the utility functions. Everybody knows what the actions can take and what agents there are. But the idea of game theory is then to say, okay, and now what do we expect the agents to actually do, if they are rational, right?
Yeah, I think it's called perfect information when they also know what the others do. Like in chess, you know what they're on.
No. So yes, then yeah. But that it's here. It's complete information. They know the structure of the game. Yeah. So no. Yeah. And now, so now I don't know why this is not. It was working. anyway, so then I use this. Okay, so here's an example. Everybody has heard of the prisoner's dilemma, maybe. So here we have two players, row player, and we have column player. And actually, in this case, they both can do the same action, right? They can cooperate, and they can defect, whatever that means. And now here, if both players cooperate, then these are the utilities, right? This is the utility of the row player, 2, and this is the utility of the column player, right? And so we have, for instance, if the row player cooperates and the column player defects, then the row player gets utility 0 and the column player gets utility 3, so it's better to defect in case the other cooperates. Yeah? So that's the structure of the game. Yeah, that's the structure of a static game with complete information. Right? Okay, but that's interesting, right? But now you want to know, so if this is the game, what do we expect the players to do? Well, well, so either cooperate, right? People cooperate, or they defect. What do you expect? Well, let's look at the cases, right? Suppose that you know that the other is not defecting, so is cooperating. What would you do? Well, so what should the row player do? Well, you look just at the utilities of the row player. And what should he do? Well, he should, of course, maximize his utility, and that means he should go for the highest number. That is, he should go for 3 instead of 2. Yeah? So he should defect. So if the other cooperates, you defect. Okay. But what if the other defects? What should you do? Well, again, right? You compare. What should you do? One of those two. You compare those two numbers. And that's 0 versus 1. Of course, what you should do is to defect. So whatever the other does, you defect. You should defect, right? Well, but of course, right, this is the case for the row player, but for the column player, it's exactly the same. Because the game is actually a symmetric game here. It doesn't matter, right? The numbers are exactly the same way. So for both players, it's actually rational and only rational to defect here. So what do you expect is that, in the end, both players end up with a utility of 1, so they're both defecting, and they end up with a utility of 1, although, well, they could have both ended up with a utility 2. But they don't do because it's not rational. Because if they do, if the one knows that the other will do, he will defect and get a higher utility. Okay, so this is actually the solution of this game then. They both will defect. And this is actually the case because in this case, the action to cooperate is dominated by the action defect. Because whatever the other does, it's always better for you to defect. Right? And that holds both for column player and for row player. So the action cooperate is dominated by the action defect. So they both defect, and that will be the unique solution of this game. Yeah? It's famous. You hear this in social dilemmas a lot. Okay. So that's what this game is. Now we're looking at another game. And that's the stag hunt. Stag hunt, right? Beautiful picture. So here are the utilities of this game. So this is the structure of this game. So if both play stag, right? So you have to hunt, right? And the idea is here that, well, to hack, so it's better to capture a stag than to capture a hare, right? So it's 3 versus 2. But to get a stag, you have to work together. You have to both hunt for stags. But to capture a hare, you can do it all by yourself, right? So if you hunt for stags, but the other hunts for hare, you don't get nothing. But if you hunt for hare, well, you always get 2 utilities. You always get 1, right? But you can, and actually you can do it by yourself. You don't have to cooperate. Okay. So what do we expect players to do? Well, look first at whether one action is dominated by another one, as we did in the previous for the prisoner's dilemma. Is one action here dominated by another? Is there one action that's always better than another, irrespective of what the other does? No, it's not. So we cannot solve the problem in the same way as we did previously. So we have to go for another solution of a game. And that's called the famous Nash equilibrium, right? So Nash we all know from this beautiful movie, Beautiful Mind. What is a Nash equilibrium in pure strategies? That's an action profile, so it's a choice of of everybody, right? Such that no one can do better. So if everybody plays his part of this profile, then no one can do better by just him doing something else. So no one can do better by unilateral deviation. Yeah? So if everybody is doing, for instance, this action, right, no one can do better by playing another action. Yeah? Okay, so let's see what are Nash equilibria of this game. Well, let's do it in the same way as we did before. So suppose that column player plays stack. What should row player do? Well, what should you compare? Well, this number and this number. So of course you should go for stack, right? Indeed, you go for stack. What if you know, and everybody knows, that column player goes for hair? What should you do? Yes, this is an interactive class, so you should help me. You go for hair, very good. So you go for hair, okay. Now, suppose that column player knows that row player goes for stack. What should column player do? Here you go, you should hunt for stack. And, well, if the other player knows that you go for hair, you should go for hair as well. So actually you have two equilibria here, because, well, here if you're here, if column player, row player knows that column player plays for stack, he goes for stack and not hair. And if, let's say, row player knows that column player goes for hair, well, everybody should go for hair as well. So row player should go for hair as well. So we have two Nash equilibria. Nobody has, so suppose that everybody's playing stack. Nobody has any good reason to play something else. And if everybody's playing hair, nobody has a reason to play anything else. Yeah? So two equilibria. Okay, so now we look at yet another game. This is called the head-tails game. And the idea is that, well, now okay, in this case, the preferences are actually very similar to one another, right? So yes, we have here 2, 0 and 0, 1, but those, in this case, the preferences are the same. And in this case, the preferences or utilities are the same. This is a different game. This is a zero-sum game where the preferences are always opposed to each other. Yes, so, and now the two actions are heads and tails. And what does that mean? Basically, well, you just have two actions, right? And the one player likes both players to do the same action. That's row player. And he gets utility 1 if they do the same. And the other player gets utility 1 if they do something different. Yes, so heads, tails, that's 1. And heads, tails, that's 1. Yeah? So, well, what would be the Nash equilibria here? Is there any way that they can decide to do this? Huh? So what should be the best strategy combination here? That nobody has any reason to deviate. Well, suppose that this was a Nash equilibrium, right? Suppose that they decided both to do that. Then, of course, hey, column player is now smart. He says, but if row player plays heads, I play, of course, tails, right? But this is also not a Nash equilibrium because row player knows, if column player plays tails, I'm better by playing heads. And then this way it goes, this is the preference goes, and then this is the preference goes. And then we go in circles all the time. So there is actually no combination that is a Nash equilibrium. Hey, that's strange because there is actually a famous result by Nash that's saying that actually all strategic games have at least one Nash equilibrium. But that result depends on saying, well, we don't just look at these actions like heads and tails, but we look at all probabilistic combinations of all actions. So instead of having the action just playing always heads or playing always tails, you also have an action saying, well, I play with probability 0.7 heads and with probability 0.3 tails, right? How do you do that? Or for instance, or 50-50, right? How do you do that? Well, you just, before you do your action, right, you first flip a coin and then, depending on what it comes out, you choose the one or the other. Yeah? Okay, maybe no. So we look now on a more general game where not just the actions heads and tails are actions that are available, but also all probabilistic combinations of those actions. So everybody has so that means that everybody has infinitely many strategies to consider. Yes, oh, that's difficult. Well, and also everybody has infinitely many actions, but still we define a Nash equilibrium in exactly the same way. Right? We still say that the Nash equilibrium is, well, an action, so a probabilistic action, such that if everybody else playing that action, nobody has any reason to deviate from that combination of actions chosen. Yeah? Is that clear? So it's just the simple generalizations of what you did before, except now that you use probabilistic actions. And the utility is just defined in the way that you expect. Okay. So, how do you now look for equilibria? How do you do that? Well, you say that, well, suppose that Q is a probability that player 2, that's now the column player, plays tails. Right? What is the utility? So that's a strategy, right? Q is now a strategy of tails, of player 2 or the column player. Now you look for each of those actions, heads and tails, what is the utility of that? Given the strategy of the column player. Well, the utility of playing heads versus that strategy is, well, with probability Q he plays heads. Oh, but you get utility 0, right? If you play heads and he plays tails, so that's 0 times he's playing a head. And, well, 1 minus Q, so this is the probability he plays heads. Well, all the other probability he has to play tails. So this is the probability that he plays tails. And in that case, you get utility 1. Right? So the utility, if you're playing head, if he plays the strategy Q is 1 times, so utility 1 times the chance that he plays heads, and utility 0 times the probability that he plays tails. And that just means 1 minus Q. Yeah? And you do exactly the same for, well, he plays again this strategy Q. What's the utility of you playing tails? Well, and that's now 0 times 1 minus Q and 1 times Q. And that's just Q. So now you know for each of the actions, heads and tails, heads and tails, what is your utility? Okay? So, now you can actually say, now you can say, so suppose, this depends on an abstract Q, right? But this can range from 0 until 1. So what would be the utility for you of playing heads, of playing only heads, right? If his Q is actually 0, so his probability of playing tails is 0, that means his probability of playing heads is 1, right? That's of course 1, because if he plays heads and you play head, you get utility 1. Yeah? Oh, but if he plays Q, if Q is 0.2, that means that his probability of playing heads is only 0.8, then you playing head has only a utility of 0.8. Right? And so you do that for every value of Q, and that's the straight line. Yeah? And of course, it's the same for the utility of you playing strategy tails, right? You can just say, okay, if he plays Q is 0, that means he plays heads, and you play tails, well, probability is, or utility is 0, and if you play head, it's actually 1 if he plays tails. Yeah? Okay, so these are the two utilities, depending on what Q is. Okay, that's what you do for player 1, but you can also do this, of course, for player 2. Oh, no, let me first say, so this is actually, so these are the utilities, depending on what the value of Q is. So what should you actually do, right? So what is the best strategy for you, and that's here P, of playing? So this is now P is the probability for you, so player 1 of playing heads. No, playing tails. Right, suppose that Q is 0, meaning that column player plays heads. What is best for you to do? Play heads. Right? That means P is the probability that you play tails should be 0. Yeah? So what is the best response if he is playing always tails? It's for you playing heads. Yeah? And actually, the best response for you to play heads, so you compare the blue line versus the red line, until he plays, well, 50% heads and 50% tails, it's always best for you to play actually heads. Yeah? So that is, probability of tails is 0. Above 0.5, it's always best for you to play tails. Right? So that's this line. And, okay, if he plays heads and tails with 50%, right, then it doesn't matter for you what he plays, what you play. Yeah? Okay, so that's for player 1, given this value of Q. But of course, you can do exactly the same for the other player. So you determine the utility of playing heads of the column player, given that given value P. So for the row player playing heads. And you can do it in exactly the same way. And well, the figure looks exactly the same, which is not very strange because it's actually the game is symmetric. Okay. So and then, right, so you get the same kind of analysis here. And you now see that, okay, you have what is the best thing for column player, for row player to do, given Q. What is the best thing for column player to do, given P? You have both. And now you can, actually, this is maybe not such a nice picture, but you can combine them together. And, oh, you can combine them together. And what is actually coming out is that, well, what you expect from this game is exactly what you kind of expect intuitively, is that, well, you want to be unpredictable because, well, you're playing against each other, right? And your preferences are exactly opposed. So, and you want to be as unpredictable as possible because if you are more predictable, then the other can make use of that. So you want to completely mix your actions. You want to play, well, half times tails, half times heads. But that holds, of course, for both players. So what you end up with is that you both play half times tails, half times. And that is then also the unique Nash equilibrium of this game. You both play half-half. Yeah? So you have this game has a Nash equilibrium, not in strict strategies, but in mixed strategies. Yeah? So it's not in contradiction with the general result of Nash that every strategic game has a Nash equilibrium. Okay, let's look at another game that we looked at before. The stag hunt. We said already, right? This game has two Nash equilibria, both playing stag, both playing hare. But then we didn't look yet at these probabilistic strategies. Right? Let's consider them also. Maybe this game also has an equilibrium with mixed strategies. So we do the same analysis. We say, okay, suppose that column player plays strategy Q, meaning the probability Q, he plays hare. What is the utility of playing stag? Well, that's just the same. It's the utility of playing stag times that he's playing stag, the probability that he's playing stag, and the utility of playing stag times that he plays hare. And that's 3 times probability. He plays stag, and 0 times the probability he plays hare. And it's the same. In the same way, you determine the utility of playing hare. Now, when does it doesn't matter for you to play hare or stag? Well, when those two numbers, 3 minus 3q and 2, respectively, when those two utilities are the same, then it doesn't matter what you play, right? And that is actually q is 1/3, and you see it here, right? So what are the utilities of playing stag? Well, if he plays stag, it's 3 for you. If he plays hare, it's 0. But the utility of playing hare, that's always 2. Yes? Now, when do you think it's best to play? Until when is it best to play stag? Yeah, come on, you will. What? Exactly until this point, and that means. Sorry? Yeah, so until Q is 1/3, it's always better to play stag. That means until you know that he plays stag with at least probability 2/3, then it's better for you to play stag. If you think that for instance, he plays half stag, half times tail, oh, it's actually better for you to play hare, for instance, right? So that's at this point. It's better to play hare. So, okay, so here you play stag, here you play hare, but actually it's for the other player, it's exactly the same thing, right? Okay, so we have one equilibrium was stag, stag, another was hare, hare, but now we find another equilibrium. Well, we can do that. And that is, well, when both players don't care, so if you play so you also have a mixed equilibrium. You also have a mixed equilibrium here, that you play 1/3 of the times you play stag and 2/3 of the times you play hare. Yeah, that's yet another equilibrium of this game. So this game has 3 equilibria. Okay. So now we looked at static games. We looked at equilibria. So we looked at dominated. So finding solutions of the game in terms of dominated strategies, finding solution of the game in terms of Nash equilibria. Then also looking at not only strict equilibria, where everybody's always playing one particular action, but rather a mixed equilibria, where everybody mixes up his actions, right? Okay, but now we're going to look at actually a different type of game, for instance, to analyze when it's good for somebody to enter, to get into a market, the chain store game. We're not going into that game, but now, so this is a different type of game. It's called an extensive form game. Until now, we assumed that if we analyze a game, we assume, so for instance, we have 2 players, right, or multiple players, that the players always do their actions, choose their actions at exactly the same time. Yeah? But of course, that doesn't always happen. It can be the case that many guys, well, first one player does a certain action, then the other observes that, and then the other player reacts to that by doing his action. Right? If you have that, then you have an extensive form game, and that looks, then it's represented as this type of tree. So we have 2 players. First, player 1 plays, and then player 2 plays, if both have only 2 actions in this case. Yes, so for instance, player 1, he chooses E or N. Well, if he chooses N, then player 1 gets utility 1, player 2 gets utility 4. Then player 2 chooses, but he only has a real choice, right? If player 1 played action E, and then he chooses A or R, and depending on what he chooses, the utilities are either 2, 2, or 0, 0. Okay? Okay, so now, actually, this game is an extensive form game, but we can still analyze this as a strategic game form, right? In strategic games. So it's like this. It's just that, well, if the first player chooses M, the value is always fixed, right? But if the first player plays E, then it depends, the utilities depend on what the second player chooses. Yes, so it was so you can think of it as an extensive form game, but you can also think of it as a strategic form game. You can rewrite it as a strategic form game. And that's that. And then we can just analyze it as we always did in terms of Nash equilibria. Yeah? Okay. Now, okay, so that was an extensive form game with perfect information. You talked about perfect information, so that means that actually player 2 saw what player 1 was actually doing. So he saw that player 1 was either playing E or N. You have another type of extensive game, namely an extensive game with imperfect information. So although player 1 chooses first, and player 2 chooses second, player 2 actually doesn't see what player 1 is choosing. So player 1 chooses first S or H. Well, think of that as stag or hare hunting, right? But player 2 doesn't see that. So he has to make an independent decision anyway, right? So he cannot make his decision depend on what the first player did. So he just plays stag or hare. And then, well, you get these utilities, but that is just so if you have this type of game, you have an extensive form game, but with imperfect information, right? So although first player 1 chooses, then player 2, but player 2 doesn't see what the first player have chosen, then it's actually, well, that's exactly comes down to the strategic game that we have looked at before. Yeah? Okay. Still, extensive form games with imperfect information, they will be important for what we're going to do later on. Because, well, because of something like this. This is so here we again play the same game as this. This was an extensive form game, right? But now we have yet another player, and that's actually nature. And nature says, okay, so it's also imperfect information. That's what you see here, right? So that means that, so at each node, in this case, this player, that's player 2, he has to choose, but he doesn't know in which node he is. Yeah? That's what imperfect information is. But now we have a third player, and the third player says or determines what is actually the state we're in. So for instance, well, it can for instance be a coin flip, so it's heads or tails, and then depending on whether the coin flip was heads or tails, right, or strong or weak, what the utilities can depend on what was the outcome of the flipping of the coin. So now we have first play nature, then we're either in that node or in that node. Now first player, he saw what the outcome of the flip coin was, and he chooses E versus N. Well, if it's N as before, then the utilities are 1, 4, and 1, 4. And afterwards, player 2 chooses A or R. But now, whether the value of A is 3, 1 or 2, well, now it depends on what is actually the value, or what is actually the outcome of this flipping of the coin by nature. Right, so let me, yes. Oh yeah, so for instance, so here's the, and you can actually represent that again as a form of strategic form game. So this is the actions of column player, he chooses A or R, just as before, nothing strange. But now the actions of row player have to be represented in a more difficult way. So what does this mean? What is this strategy? This strategy says, well, so remember, right, the first player, he sees the outcome of the coin flipping. He sees the action of nature. Yeah? And now this strategy means, oh, I play E in case the outcome of the flipping coin was strong, right? You're in that state. And the second E is the outcome of the flipping coin was weak. Or better, this one, right? So he plays E in case the flipping was strong, and he plays N in case the flipping was weak. Yeah? Clear what this means? And so for all possibilities. Now, you get the utilities. How is that determined? Well, suppose, okay, for NN, right? So if the first player plays N, well, the utilities are always 1, 4. So nothing mysterious there. Let's look at this one. 2.5, 1.5. So now, well, if the outcome of the flipping was strong, and player 1 did action E, and player 2 did action A, then the outcome would be 3-1, right? Okay, but that's only 50% of the cases, right? Because, so this is the case, but only in 50% of the cases, because in 50% of the cases, the outcome of the flipping was strong. The other 50% of the cases, the outcome of the flipping was weak, and we should also take into account the utilities there. So you should look now at expected utilities. So in half of the case, this is what the outcome is of the actions of player 1 and player 2, and half of the cases, this is the outcome. So the expected outcome is, well, 3 plus 2 divided by 2 is 2.5, and 1 plus 2 divided by 2 is 1.5. Yeah? So you go here for expected utilities. Is this clear? Okay, so this is the way to represent games of imperfect information. Okay, now, what game theory needs in order to analyze it is that we always have enough information about the game. So players need to know what is the begin point of the game, what are the actions, what are the utilities, and so on, right? And in particular, what are the utilities? However, in many real-life situations, right, you really don't know what are your utilities. If I play, I know maybe my utilities, but I don't know your utilities. And that's called a game of incomplete information. I don't know what your utilities are. However, well, in that case, actually, game theorists cannot analyze the game. So it's over, right? But we still want to analyze the game, so what do? We say that, okay, I don't know, let's say, whether we're in strong or in the weak position, right? But I have a guess on, well, what the third player is doing, namely nature. Right, so you add an extra player of the game, call it nature, and you just say, well, and we both know so both player 1 and player 2 know what is the probability that we start out here, and what is the probability that we start out here. And then, if we both know that, then we both know actually the structure of the game and the utilities. And then we can analyze it in terms using the standard tools. So, these games of incomplete information, they cannot be analyzed, but game theorists are smart. They say, well, you do want to analyze the game, so we add to the game an extra probability of the beginning states, of what utilities are, and they are common knowledge, and then they are actually games of imperfect information, and then we can analyze them, right? And then we can use them, the standard ways of doing things. Okay, so that's the first important lesson. So an extensive form game, we will see that we use them if we analyze signaling games as well. So what is that? We have a set of players, a rooted tree, an n tuple of payoffs for each terminal node of the tree, and so on. That's just the basic stuff. Okay, that's the first part. So that's just the basic setup of static games versus extensive games. Any question about this? If not, then we go to the second part, and that is convention, right? So now we start to analyze. Now we're going to use, the idea is now we're going to use game theory to analyze conventions. And of course, what I really want to go to is to use, in the end, to account for linguistic conventions. Okay, now David Lewis was the first to say we can actually use game theory to analyze conventions. And now the next couple of minutes I will say about how this can be done. Okay, so I'll first go into Lewis's definition of a convention. Then I will introduce signaling games, and then I will say, okay, right, so maybe there are some problems for that. Okay, first, okay, in philosophy, I don't know, there are philosophers among you, but in philosophy, right, in the 1930s, it was assumed that, well, first of all, lots of people assumed that, hey, the meaning of natural language, that's conventional, right? But philosophers also assumed, oh, actually, what are to account for mathematical truth and for logical truth? Oh, that's purely conventional as well. So many people have said that, people like Carnap. And Quine was philosopher, was a famous philosopher who said, oh, that cannot be. At least not in the most straightforward way. What is the most straightforward way to think of truth as conventional truth? Is just saying, well, what is a conventional truth? Something that you do by explicit agreement. Right? So we just agree on what are, let's say, the axioms of logic that we agree on, or the axioms of mathematics, or what we just agree on what is the meaning of chair or table. Right? Okay. Quine said, yeah, it looks very nice, but it can't work, because how do you make an agreement like that? Yes? You can only agree on, okay, this is the meaning of chair. Well, if you're going to explicitly agree on that, and you use language for that, so you need already a convention to establish a convention, if convention is established by agreement. Hey, but how do you come then to the earlier convention? So you have to, if this is again by agreement, you have to use again convention for that. So that's like a vicious regress of this idea that you can establish convention in terms of agreement. It doesn't work. At least not in the most straightforward way. But David Lewis wants to say, no, well, maybe it can work, right? But not in the most straightforward way. Okay. So what he wants to, look at, actually, maybe I should say that it has something similar happened in social philosophy, right? So, for instance, there was, I don't know, you might have heard of Hobbes, right? The Leviathan. Has anyone heard of Hobbes' Leviathan? He also said, right, we have a way of organizing the state, and we do that actually by explicit agreement. And David Hume was the first who said, no, we don't need explicit agreement to account for the political organization. We do that by convention, right? And he also said it the same for language, actually. So basically, the idea of David Lewis is very much David Hume, right? Somebody who, there's a statue here in Edinburgh, I believe. Isn't that true? At least he lived here. And by the way, Adam Smith, maybe even more famous than David Hume to many of you, he just took the idea from David Hume. So, well, anyway. So, and David Lewis's idea was to analyze conventions in terms of coordination problems. And you have many coordination problems, he says. Okay. So here's, for instance, one coordination problem represented in terms of a game, of a strategic game. So we have two players, row and column, and they both have three actions to choose between. Playing or one or two or three. And now these are the utilities. Right? And of course, so this is the coordination problem. So what does that mean? Well, they both would be happy if they would explicitly agree on, the one playing row player plays strategy 1 and column player plays strategy 1, right? Then they both would be happy, and none of them has any reason to deviate from that, because he gets a utility of less. But of course, right, they would be equally happy if row played strategy 2 and column played strategy 2. So the idea is that actually, well, suppose that you have utilities like this, coordination problems like this, right? So that this is actually a problem that occurs again and again. Oh, then it's good to always do, well, his first action and the other one's first action, right? But of course, it would be equally good to play both times action 2. So a coordination problem is, a situation like this, where, well, there are several ways to solve this problem, and it actually doesn't matter for the participants involved what way it is actually solved, right? And at least, as long as they both, have some kind of explicit or implicit agreement on how they should solve the game. Yeah? Okay. So this is a complete coordination problem. They have exactly the same preferences, right? And then it's obvious how to, that these three solutions would be good for both of them. But actually we have other games where the preferences are not exactly the same. For instance, right, if you look at the game, you will see that, well, if column player plays C1, it's actually best for row player to do R1, right, because you have to compare 1.5 versus 0.2 and 0, so it's better for him to do this. And if row player plays strategy 1, then it's best for column player to place C1 as well. So this is actually a Nash equilibrium. This is also a Nash equilibrium, and this is also a Nash equilibrium, right? But, of course, row player in this case, so we have 3 Nash equilibria. If the other one is doing his part of the Nash equilibrium, you should do as well. You should do your part. But, of course, row player actually prefers this equilibrium to this equilibrium, right? Because here he gets value 1/2, and here he gets only value 1. And the other way around for column player. He prefers this equilibrium, right? Still, if the other player plays his part of the equilibrium, you should do your part. You have no reason to deviate, right? So you can think of, well, a solution to this game as, yeah, so it's a solution to the game, although you don't necessarily have the same preferences. Okay, let's forget about that. Now David Lewis, okay, so until now we said, okay, that's just a Nash equilibrium, right? So we have a coordination problem, that was the utilities, and now we just look at Nash equilibria. But David Lewis said, no, Nash equilibrium, that's not good enough. We need a stronger notion to think of actually convention, because he wants to analyze convention. That means a solution to a problem like this that comes up again and again and again. Yeah, so this is the idea. This problem, this comes up again and again, and then, and how do you, what should you do? Okay. And David Lewis proposes that, well, what we should go for is a stronger notion of equilibrium, namely a coordination equilibrium. And that's an action profile in which no agent would have been better off. So a Nash equilibrium is no agent would be better off given what the other, so no agent has any reason to deviate from the strategic profile that we're considering. So you yourself don't benefit from doing something else if everybody else does his part of the equilibrium. Yeah? A coordination problem says not only you could be better off if you deviate, but nobody else could be better off if you deviate. So that's a stronger notion of equilibrium. It's a coordination equilibrium. Let's see how that works. So here's another game. So it's just until row 3 and column 3 is just the same as we had before, but we just add for both players an extra action to do. And these are the utilities, and I claim that this is actually a Nash equilibrium as well. Do you agree with that? So R4, C4 is also a Nash equilibrium. Why is that? Well, suppose that row player plays R4. What is the best thing for column player to do? C1, C2, 3, or C4. So you should compare this, and this. So what should he do? C4. Yeah? Column player plays C4. So what is the best for row player to do? R1, R2, R3, or R4? So you should compare 0, 0, 0.2. Oh, so this is a Nash equilibrium. But it's not a coordinating equilibrium because a coordinating equilibrium was stronger than a Nash equilibrium by saying that, okay, no one has any benefit from anyone changing his action. Yeah? Oh, but suppose we're here and row player does another action. Let's say playing 3. Then column player benefits from that because 0.5 is higher than 0.2. Okay, he cannot do it himself, column player cannot do it himself. He cannot influence getting this higher utility, but still it can be influenced. So this is actually not a coordinating equilibrium. It's a Nash equilibrium, it's not a coordinating equilibrium. Yeah? So David Lewis says, okay, to solve coordination problems we need something more than a Nash equilibrium. Actually, we need even more than that. For instance, it must have at least more than one coordinating equilibrium. And that is, of course, the case here, right? Because we have here, this game has at least 3 Nash equilibria, but these are also coordinating equilibria. To think of this as a convention, right? Doing always this, or doing always this, or doing always that. It must be arbitrary what you choose. To a certain extent, it must be arbitrary what you choose, right? Okay, so But it must be arbitrary, meaning that there are yet other coordinating equilibria as well. Right? Then it's a conventional solution of a game. Yeah? You see this? Okay. So, it must have more than one coordinating equilibrium. Okay. But it's not just that, it must also matter. So, Lewis says, not only it must be an S equilibrium, no one can benefit, coordinating equilibrium, there must be more than one for it to be a convention, but also it must actually matter what you do. In this case, in this game, right, R1, C1 and R1, C2 would both be coordinating equilibria. But here it doesn't really matter for the players, for a column player, for instance, whether he plays C1 or C2. So, yeah, they're both equilibria, both coordinate equilibria, but who cares what you do, right? Okay, the idea of David Lewis is, no, it must be a proper, or better, a strict equilibrium, right? It must really be better than the alternatives. So for you, play C1 is really better than playing C2, given that the other plays R1. And that's not the case here. So that's also ruled out by David Lewis. So his solution is a coordinating. So for instance, for something to be possibly to be a convention, a coordinating problem must contain at least two proper coordinating equilibria. Yeah? Okay, that's nice. So, we have a coordinating problem, and we saw, right, what are the equilibria of the game. But now, of course, we want to know, yeah, but suppose that we have a coordinating problem, so it doesn't matter what you play, right? So we have various solutions, equilibria, but what should you play if you have a coordinating problem? Suppose you have this coordinating problem, right? So, yeah, if both, so R1 and C2 and C1 would be good, and R2 and C2 would be good, right? But what should you do? R1 or R2 if you're a role player? What would you do? Well, you have no idea, right? Depends on what the other player is doing. Hey, but you cannot observe what the other player is doing because, well, you choose, that's the assumption, you choose your actions independently of each other or at the same time. Yeah? So you cannot rely on what the other is doing. So what do? Well, you don't expect it on what you see from the other, but you do it what you expect that the other will do. Because if you expect that the other will play, the column player will play C1, well, more than half of the time, then it's always better to play R1. Yeah? And if you expect that the other player will play C2, then of course it's better to play R2. Yeah? Because these figures are determined in exactly the same way as we did before. Oh, so actually, what do we see here? How many equilibria, what are the Nash equilibria of this game? What do you think? Somebody guess? What are the equilibria of this game? Nash equilibria. Come on. We talked about already some equilibria. Yeah, which ones? Yeah, and there's yet another one. Because you can think of mixing, right? So what would be another equilibrium of this game? Well, I mean, not any symmetric, but anyway, then there's other one more. So what is that? Half-half, right? If you both of you play, toss a coin, then, well, if the other tosses a coin, it doesn't matter what you play, right? Whether you play R1 or R2, what do you care? You might as well toss a coin as well, actually. So that's actually also an Nash equilibrium. But so this is also an Nash equilibrium. That's obviously not a very good convention, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, if the other player flips a coin, then you can play only R2.
Why is that?
Or R1, and it's also a Nash.
Yeah, it's equally good. Yes. Yeah, yes. So there are infinitely many equilibria. That's true. Yes, exactly. So if the other player tosses a coin, it doesn't matter what you play. You might as well toss a coin as well, right? But you can play R1 always. You can play R1 80% of the time. You can play R1 50% of the time. Anything, it wouldn't matter what you play. Yeah.
Sorry.
So no, it's not a no. But I mean, it would be a best response if the other player plays that. Then it doesn't matter for you to play. But if the other player knows that you play 80% of the time R1, then of course the other player will always play C1. That's the best response then. So best response and best response, that would be a Nash equilibrium. That is both playing half-half.
So this half-half is not stable.
Well, we'll see that. We'll see that. We will come back to that. Actually, over not such a long time. Okay. So we have here three Nash equilibria, both playing R1 on C1, R2 C2, but also we have a Nash equilibrium, both playing it by tossing a coin. Yeah? Because then you might as well toss a coin as well. Okay. So what you play depends on your expectations. But where do these expectations come from, right? So how to solve a coordination problem, it depends on your expectations. Okay, great. But where do these expectations come from? Right? Well, and actually it depends on your expectation, but you also have to rely on somebody else's expectations, right? Because they both have to be in agreement, let's say. Where do they come from? Well, they can actually come from three sources, says David Lewis. They can be explicit agreement, which is actually a kind of salience. They can be salience. So if you both have to choose between those three, what would you choose? Or between those four squares, what would you choose? And so that you only get value 1 if you both choose the same square. What would you choose? Well, I would choose this one. I don't know about you, right? Because it stands out. If you have to go for a unique action, maybe you will do the same, because, I mean, there's no reason to choose this. Well, it stands out as well. It's the most left one. And this is the most left middle one, but, I mean, this one is more salient than the others. Yeah? So that's salience can do. Well, or precedence, right? So why do you choose one equilibrium above the other? Well, because in previous cases, we've done that. Yeah? So these are the three ways that David Lewis sees it. Okay. So here's then the first definition that David Lewis gives of what a convention is. So it's a regularity in behavior of the members of a population P when they are agent in a recurrent situation S. So this recurrent situation is modeled by the strategic game. Yeah? And this is a convention, so it's a solution to this situation S. It's a convention, if and only if any instance of S among members of P, if everybody conforms to this regularity, if everybody expects everyone else to conform to this regularity, and everybody prefers to conform to this regularity R on condition that the others do. Since S is a coordination problem, a uniform conformity to R is a proper coordination in S. So that's where the proper coordination comes in. Yes, so you have these expectations, and you have the expectation that everybody else forms it. Why is that? Well, and it must be a proper coordination, a proper equilibrium. Okay. So again, right, so we are in this game. So, and then why, so you're considering you're a role player, you're considering do I play R1 or R2? Oh, I say I prefer R1, let's say. I prefer R1. Why is that so? Well, because I expect you play C1. And of course I'm rational, right? Because hey, I go for maximize my utility. And I expect you to play C1, I should do R1. Because 1 is higher than 0. Okay, good. But why do I expect you to play C1? Well, David Lewis says, well, I expect you to play C1 because I expect that you expect that I will play R1. Right? Because I have reason that I have reason to play R1 because I expect you to play C1. You have reason to play C1 because you think that I play R1. So that is, I expect that you expect that I play R1. Okay, but why do I expect that you expect that I play R1? Because I expect that you expect that I expect that you play C1. Right? So we have to go higher and higher and higher to the hierarchy. Actually, infinitely high. So that's actually here. You go up, you go up, you go up. And actually, you also have to all assume not only that I am rational and you are rational, but I also expect that you think that I'm rational. And you expect that I am rational. So not only is the case that we have these expectations, but we also have the expectation that everybody is rational. So, and it goes up into infinity, and actually it has to be common knowledge that everybody is rational. That comes out, and common knowledge means at every possible level, well, we all think that everybody is rational, and it has to be common knowledge. Yeah. And we have those. So it's very high order reasoning and very high order knowledge. It has to be there for solving these very simple coordination problems. So a convention, to account for conventions, David Lewis says, we need common knowledge, and it's very high level reasoning, which is very rationalistic. Is that what we do, right? Now the question is that what we do to solve a coordination problem? Well, we have a good reason, right? So if we solve it one way, then we have a good reason to stick to that one, to stick to that particular convention. Yeah? But why did that convention ever arise? Okay. So one question is then, how can we produce these higher order expectations? And then David Lewis says, well, we can do it via agreement. Okay. We can do it via salience, or we can do it via precedent. Oh, okay. And then the final definition of a convention, according to David Lewis, is a regularity R in behavior of members of a population P when there are agents in a recurrent situation S is a convention, if and only if it's true that, and it is common knowledge in P, so common knowledge is now added, that in any instance of S among members of P, everyone confers to R, it's the same as before, everyone expects everyone else to conform to R, it's the same as, and everyone prefers to conform to R on condition that the others do, since S is a coordination problem, and conformity to R is a coordination equilibrium. But now, the thing that's added is this common knowledge. Yes? Okay. Okay. Now, I'm going to, okay, so that's David Lewis, but David Lewis, so that's what a convention is, but he wanted to account actually for linguistic conventions, for communication conventions. And to study communication, he actually invented a new kind of game, and that's a signaling game, although actually they were already invented in a somewhat different way by biologists, because actually animals communicate as well, right? Okay, so David Lewis came up with signaling games, and he called them signaling games, and that's what everybody's calling them now. And he gave an example of, well, a convention, a signaling convention, in terms of this guy, Paul Revere. Does anyone know who Paul Revere is? Is there an American in the room? Okay, he played an important part in the battle between the Englishmen, against the Englishmen in the American Independence War. Anyway, it doesn't matter. What did he do? Well, he kind of made an agreement with the other Americans, right? So he had the redcoats, and the redcoats were, of course, the Englishmen who were the occupants of America, and the Americans were fighting against that, and they made kind of an agreement, but a conditional agreement. They said, okay, if the redcoats are observed staying home, hang no lantern in the belfry. If the redcoats are observed setting out by land, hang one lantern in the belfry, and if the redcoats are observed setting out by sea, hang 2 lanterns in the belfry. Right, and now, of course, so that's what this guy was doing, who was looking at the Englishmen. And of course, well, then the other Americans, they responded to this, well, no lantern, 1 lantern, or 2 lanterns. Yes? So here we have actually, so we have a sendal of a signal, hanging 1 lantern, or hanging no lantern, or hanging 2 lanterns, right? And this has a meaning for both parties. This has a meaning if the signaler has this strategy and a receiver has, well, a corresponding strategy, right? Don't do anything if the English are not coming, right? Put your troops by land if you see one lantern, and put your troops by sea if you see two lanterns. Yeah? Okay. And then, of course, seeing a letter just has already a meaning. And that's the idea, right? So you can give meaning to a signal like one or two lanterns if you have a convention corresponding in convention in strategies. Okay. So here we have a simpler case. Here we see actually a game, an extensive form game of imperfect information. What is that? Well, we have three players, right? We have nature, who tosses a coin, right? Nature can do that. And it says, well, in 50% cases we're in one situation as one, and 50% of the cases we're in the other situation, that's as two. Okay? Then we have two players, a signaler and a receiver. They are called signaling games, or signal receiver games. The signaler, he can do two things. He can observe whether he's in state 1 or state 2. He can observe the action of nature, right? And then he can send, well, one or two messages, M1 or M2. But his messages don't have any meaning yet, right? They're just message, or oo, or boo, or ba. That's all, yeah? Okay. And then the receiver, okay, he doesn't receive which state he's in, right? That's what this dotted line says, and this dotted line. He doesn't receive, he doesn't see in which situation he's in, but he does see whether sender sent one or sent message M1 or M2, right? And he now has to choose an action, A1 or A2, whatever they are, yeah? Okay, and then both get a utility. Oh, they get a good utility in case and the utility only depends on which situation you're in and on the action taken. So if you're in situation 1, action A1 is good for both, and action 2 would be bad for both, right? And it's the same here. And if you're in situation S2, A2 would be good for both, and action 1 would be bad for both. Okay, clear what this game is? Okay. So, well, this is a kind of game that we saw before. It's an extensive game with imperfect information. Yeah? It's similar. So we can actually analyze it. Here are, what are the actions that players take? Well, they're a little bit difficult because the actions depend on, well, the action of the receiver depend on which message he got, right? Because he sees that. And the action of the signaler might depend on which situation he's in, right? Because he observes that. So both actions are strategies and actually are conditional strategies. So here are the actions of the sender. He can say, independent of which situation I am, I always choose message M1, boo. I always say boo. And here, always say ba, or, well, depending on which situation I am, I say boo or ba, right? Or the other way around. That's the sender. And the receiver, he can say, well, independent of which message I received, I always do, well, A1, whatever that is. Independent of which message I see, I always do A2, whatever that is. Or, well, if I hear M1, I do action A1. If I hear M2, I do action A2. Or the other way around. Because the actions, or the messages don't have any meaning, right? They say boo or ba. What does that mean? Yeah? Clear? Okay. So now, we have a game that both players have 4 strategies. Yeah? Okay, and we've said before that whether we're in situation S1 or S2, well, nature determines, right? But it's 50% chance. Okay. So now we can actually determine the utilities of this game. So the strategic form, the game in strategic form. So again, right? So for instance, this strategy was, in S1, I play M2, and in S2, I play M1. Right? And A1, A2 means if I see action M1, I play A1. If I see message M2, I play A2. Yeah? Okay. These are the utilities. Well, here are the expected utilities, I should say. So, if the one is playing M1, M2, and the other playing A1, A2, then they always get value 1. Do you see why? So we have something like this. If the strategy of signaler is this, M1, M2, and S1 and S2, and the strategy of the receiver is playing A1 if you saw M1 and A2 if you saw M2, then, well, A1 is done as S1 and A2 is done in S2. That's perfect, right? You always get value 1. So the expected value is value 1. Oh, it's just on here. Anyway. So this is a Nash equilibrium and it has value 1. But of course, right? Okay, so here, well, in a sense, so M1 signals to the receiver that you're in situation S1. But I mean, hey, these messages are just boo or ba, right? What do you care? Whether you say boo or ba? So the meaning of the messages doesn't really matter. So this is the same equilibrium. That's actually this equilibrium. That's equally good, right? That you call this a table or a chair, right? And this thing, so this thing a chair and this a table, or the other way around. Who cares? As long as we agree on something. So that's this versus this. And both are Nash equilibria. Look at the game, right? You see both are Nash equilibria. But actually, this game has more Nash equilibria, right? For instance, if the sender always sends M1, well, then it doesn't matter, actually, for the receiver much what to do, right? For instance, you can always, whatever message the other sends, you can always play A1. Doesn't matter. And if you always play A1, whatever message you receive, it doesn't matter what you send. You might as well always send M1. So this is actually also a Nash equilibrium. And you have many more Nash equilibria here. Right? You see here, for instance, M1 always sending M1 and always. So that's the top thing there. That's a Nash equilibrium. This is a Nash equilibrium. And you have even more. Yeah? Okay, and now David Lewis says, so we have Nash equilibria, but he says, no, but only those things are actually signaling systems of the same. And only those things, so this is, all three of them are Nash equilibria, but this one is not a good Nash equilibrium, not a good enough Nash equilibrium to be a convention. Only those two can be conventions, and he calls them signaling systems. Okay, and David Lewis says, now, I now have the, okay, and now I should say maybe, okay, so now we have we have two possibly conventions. And now his idea is that, well, although M1 and M2, being boo or ba, they don't have any meaning, right? They don't have any pre-given meaning. If both players, if this is a convention, if both players agree on playing always their part of the equilibrium, then M1 and M2 actually do get meanings, right? So M1 now means S1, so boo means I'm in S1. Or, another different meaning, M1 means, oh, play A1. You can think of meanings in a descriptive way, in which situation you are, or in an imperative way. You do that way. You do that action. Right? So, if this is the equilibrium, M2 or M1 and M2, they don't have a pre-given meaning, but they get a meaning as if this is an equilibrium. Well, but I mean, whether you call something a table or a chair doesn't matter as long as everybody agrees. Everybody always does the same thing, so this is equally good convention. Yeah? So both are possible conventions. Okay. So and now if these are the equilibria, the conventional equilibria, then David Lewis says, I've now described the character of a case of signaling without mentioning the meaning of the signals. That two lanterns meant that the red coats were going by sea or whatever. but nothing important seems to have been left out. So what has been said must somehow imply that the signals have their meaning. So they says, right, so being a solution to a signaling game, that's enough to describe meaning. So we can describe meaning in terms of a convention, and we didn't need conventions to account for these new conventions, right? So we get out of this circle, that this vicious regress that Quine thought that we required, right? We don't need a convention to establish a convention. Okay, that's good. Now, maybe I think I do that afterwards. There is, yeah, okay, so there's been a lot of work since David Lewis. David Lewis wrote his book Conventions, actually as his PhD thesis, I should say. So all of you who write a PhD thesis and you want to be as famous as Lewis, well, it has to be that groundbreaking. There has been a lot of, well, a lot of people like what David Lewis did, but also there has been some well, criticism, obviously, and one of the things is that, well, one of the criticisms, and that's what we will come back to, is that, well, David Lewis' analysis of conventions required a lot of rationality, right? We had all these levels of rationality, and a lot of common knowledge. All these levels of knowledge, you must know what I know, blah, 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 blah. Right? And that seems to be a very rationalistic solution. Moreover, another criticism is that, yeah, okay, suppose that we have a regularity of behavior, right? So I have a conventional way of solving a coordination problem. Then, of course, right, then this analysis explains why you would stay with that. You would stay with that solution of the coordination problem because you have no reason to do any better, and you expect that the other will do his part of the solution, and if he does, then you have no good reason to do anything else. Actually, you have all the reason to say the same thing. So what David Lewis explained, and everybody agrees with that, is that, well, if we have a convention, you can explain why this convention remains stable. Yeah? The problem is that, well, David Lewis, he didn't give any analysis of why this convention, so we have now several possible ways of solving a game, but why does this convention come out instead of another one? So he didn't explain how this convention could have arisen. Is that good English? Arisen. Okay. So these are the two criticisms. And I will come back to both of them after the break. I think that's a very good point to have a break. Okay? Okay, so we're going to get on with the next part, and that is looking at things from an evolutionary point of view. But before we do that, we're going to look at games, or signaling games from an evolutionary point of view. But first I'm going to, well, say you more about evolutionary game theory and the solution of games from an evolutionary point of view. And that's evolutionary stable strategies. Then we apply that to signaling games, and then we say some of the results of the literature. Okay. So, now, from an evolutionary point of view, we want to analyze conventions in the end. So what is the idea? Suppose that we have, well, basically here. Suppose we have a large population, and, okay, we have this game, and everybody, all the members of the population, they play this game. They are randomly paired to each other, and they play this game. Oh, and each individual in the game, he has a particular strategy that he always uses. Why is he doing that? Well, it's given by his father or mother, right? It's genetically given. Okay. So they play the game against somebody else. They both get a payoff for playing that game, right? And now the idea is that, okay, the payoff, what does payoff means? It means how many children you get, right? So basically means if you do well, you get more children, or your offspring is bigger, and if you do not so well, you get less offspring. And in the end, what will happen then is that, well, good strategies, they tend to, so the whole population will tend to do all the same strategies, right? And then we have a convention. So we're going to analyze conventions now in terms of evolution. Okay. But we want to actually say, what does it mean to be, for a strategy to be evolutionary stable? Okay. So I said already, what does it mean that a strategy or population states, which population states are evolutionary stable? Well, that all members of the population are playing the same strategy, and so everybody is playing the same strategy, but now you have a new guy, he plays a different strategy, right? Well, he cannot invade this population, so he will immediately drop out of the population. He will not do well against the population does much better. Okay. Now, what can you already know? So they're all playing a particular game, right? But the evolutionary strategy is one where everybody is playing the same strategy. Oh, but that means, right? Think of it as game, that you look at symmetric solutions of the game, right? So where everybody is doing the same thing. So it's on the diagonal. If you think of it again, it's on the diagonal. Okay. So here's an example of a game. It's called the dove-hawk game. It's a famous one. So we have two players, well, playing hawkish and playing dovish, right? Think of the American politicians, right? Then, well, if the one plays hawkish and the other is a dove, the hawk wins. He gets all the points, V for victory, and the other way around. If they both are doves, right, they get, well, they divide the points between them, and if they both hawk, well, they also divide the points between them, but there's a cost. But because they fight, right, there's a cost. Okay, so this is the general setup of this game. But now we can actually fill in the details by saying what V and C are. Right, so let's say that V is 4 and C is 3. Then we end up with this game, and this is a symmetric game, right? Both players are doing the same actions. It's a symmetric game. But what are the equilibria of this game? Does somebody already see what are the equilibrium of this game? So if I play hawk, what do you play? So you are the column player. If I play hawk, you play? You have to compare those numbers. So you play? You play dove. If you play dove, what do I play? Oh. So hawk, dove is actually an equilibrium, right? Well, if you play hawk, yeah, I play dove, and if I play dove, you play hawk. So dove, so these two are actually the equilibria of the game. At least in pure strategies, right? So you're not allowed to mix. So these two are the pure Nash equilibria. But there's a problem, right? These equilibria are not symmetric equilibria. They are not on the diagonal. And thus it cannot, now the idea is they do something different. And the convention, right? So an evolutionary stable strategy, but we will analyze conventions in terms of evolutionary stable strategies. There will always be such that the equilibria are symmetric. So they're all doing the same thing. Because all the population is doing the same thing. Well, here, one plays hawk, the other plays dove. So that cannot be an evolutionary stable strategy. Yeah? So here we don't have an evolutionary stable strategy in pure strategies, at least. Oh. We don't have that. But it's a symmetric game, right? So actually, if it's a symmetric game, so we have here, well, we have here the payoffs for row player and for column player, but it's a symmetric game, so we can actually, so the same actions and the utilities are the same as well, meaning that, yeah, depending on what the other does. So if you play hawk and the other plays dove, you always get 4 and the other gets 0, and here it's the same, right? But then for a column player versus row player. So actually you don't have to look at both of these utilities. You can just concentrate on your own utilities. So we can actually simplify, because it's a symmetric game, you can actually think of the game in this way. So just at your own utilities. And now, so it's an evolution, we want to look at symmetric equilibria, so we want to look at things at this diagonal. But at the diagonal, we don't have an equilibrium. We don't have an equilibrium yet, at least not in pure strategies. So that's basically what I said. Okay. So neither pure strategy profile here can be an evolutionary stable strategy. So, well, we saw that already before, right? If you don't have an equilibrium in pure strategies, maybe you can have an equilibrium in mixed strategies. So what we have to look at in general is to look at mixed strategies, right? So we're going to do that. Okay, so we're going to say that, well, we have this A, and that is just, well, for each choice, so I is now the action of the row player, and G the action of the column player, is the payoff matrix. And if the game has n strategies, the mixed strategy is a point in the simplex, it doesn't matter, right? So everybody is just, so this is the payoffs of the game. And now a strategy is just a probabilistic mix of, well, playing the first action or your second action, right? And now this means a row player plays A1 and column player plays A1. Row player plays A1, column player plays A2, right? That's what those things mean. Okay. So these are the utilities. And now, suppose, just as before, suppose that your opponent plays strategy Q. What does that mean? He plays action A1 with probability Q1 and action A2 with probability Q2. What is then the expected utility of you playing A1? Well, that's this. It's, well, the utility of both playing A1 with probability Q1, if the other plays with probability Q1 strategy A1, and utility of A12 if the other player plays strategy Q with probability Q. Yeah? Q2, sorry. And in the same way, you can determine what is the expected utility of you playing A2. Right? Given that the other player has this strategy Q, fat Q. You can determine the expected utilities, and that is basically just the utility metric, or vector, or matrix, times, well, the probabilities, and then you get this. And what do these numbers mean? They mean the following. So the first row, that is just the expected utility of you playing A1 if the other plays strategy fat Q, it means Q1 playing A1 and Q2 playing A2. And this thing is just the expected utility of you playing strategy 2. Yeah? And then the expected utility of playing pure strategy I is then this AQ, and then the ith row. Okay? Now, okay, your opponent plays strategy P. Okay, and now you don't play a pure strategy, you play yourself also a mixed strategy, for instance, fat P, right? And now you can determine, again, the expected utility of both you playing your mixed strategy and the other is playing his mixed strategy, of her mixed strategy. And actually, you can do that in the following way. And what is important, so what you have to remember is that this is what is meant. So you play strategy fat, you play strategy P, the other plays strategy Q. This is the expected utilities you get. Both of you get. Yeah? Okay. Now we know the utilities. Now you can say what is actually a Nash equilibrium. A symmetric Nash equilibrium, right? So everybody's doing the same thing. When would Q is a strategy, a mixed strategy, right? So this percentage you play that act, and that percentage you play that act. When is Q? When is that a mixed strategy? This is true if for all other mixed strategies, P, right? Well, the expected utility of Q playing against Q is higher than the expected utility of P playing against Q. So Q does best against itself. Yeah? At least there's nothing better. Okay, that's Nash equilibrium. A strict, that's a symmetric Nash equilibrium. Everybody's playing the same thing. A strict symmetric Nash equilibrium is that actually the expected utility of playing Q against Q is higher than expected utility of playing anything else against Q for any P. That's anything else. Yeah? So it's just the best. Okay, that's a strict Nash equilibrium. Okay, but we were after the evolutionary stable strategy. And that was, remember, that was the entire population is using the same strategy, no other strategy can invade. So you basically assume that, oh, okay, right? Everybody, or better, almost everybody is playing a certain strategy. And if you were playing another strategy, that means that not everybody is playing the same strategy because you might play another strategy, then you cannot benefit. You cannot grow in that population. Yeah? Okay, so what does that mean? Now this means, okay, so suppose that almost the whole population plays Q. That means that everybody, so with probability 1 minus epsilon, and epsilon is small, everybody plays Q. Yeah? But there are some people who play another strategy, and that's a very small percentage, that's epsilon. They play strategy P. Yeah? So this is now what you do, and then playing P against what the group is doing is less good than playing Q against what the group is doing, given that most people are doing Q. Yeah? So now Q is an evolutionary stable if basically there is no other strategy. So no, if for all other strategies, right, them playing against the whole group is less than you playing against the whole group. Okay. Oh, I can use this, wasn't it so? Yes. So Q is the incumbent strategy, so that's the strategy that basically the whole group is, and now you're going to check whether that strategy is evolutionary stable, and you say, well, it cannot be invaded by another strategy. So you check for each possible invader, P, another mixed strategy, whether it's really less good against the group than the others. And the fraction epsilon is just, well, that's the percentage of invaders. Okay, that's basically what I said. The invader, the expected utility of the invader is less fit than that of, well, if you're playing the same strategy as the group. Yeah? So basically the invader has no chance. It's not beneficial for the invader. So if he tries to get into the group, right, with a few of them, then he will be thrown out of the group. That's the idea. He cannot stay there. Okay. So what does it mean? Forget about, well, you can read the first thing, but another way of writing down what an evolutionary stable strategy is, it says, well, that either it's a strict, so either Q is a strict Nash equilibrium, meaning that you playing Q against Q is better than playing P against Q. Or, if that is the same, then, so if you play against all other members that play strategy Q, then you play Q, that's better than playing P. Right? So P has no advantage against all other members of the population. Right? So normally, so Q is better. Or suppose that you have a strategy that does equally well as Q against the whole population. Then Q can still, so if there is such a P, then Q can still be evolutionary stable if, now there is this small percentage, or epsilon, that plays P, right? If you playing against P is better than P playing against P. So if the invaders if they're playing against themselves, it's actually less good than you playing against the invaders. Yeah, the last should be a P instead of a B. Yes. So when is something evolutionary stable? If you're better against the whole group than anyone else, if you're playing the same strategy is always advantageous compared to other strategies, then it's a strict Nash equilibrium, then it's good. Or if it's not a strict Nash equilibrium, but still a Nash equilibrium, and it can still be evolutionary stable if, well, if you are actually better against the strategy of the invader than the strategy of the invader does against another strategy of the invader. Then you can still be an evolutionary stable strategy. Okay, so there are two ways of writing that down. This is the way that I said. You can also say, oh, it's a Nash equilibrium, but you're doing against the invader is better than the invader against the invader. Okay. So the first thing, it means that every symmetric strict Nash equilibrium is an evolutionary stable strategy, right? But not only that, also you can be a Nash equilibrium, but it has to be symmetric. So every evolutionary stable strategy is at least a symmetric Nash equilibrium. But it can be, but then this extra condition has to be fulfilled. Okay. And now you can look for each of the games that you play, right? Because you assume that all members of the population that play a certain game. And then you can fill in your game and then see what are the evolutionary stable strategies of this type of game. So here you have the prisoner's dilemma, the pure coordination game, the stag hunt, and actually the weakly dominated games. And we're going to look at some of them. I should say this is, so the weakly dominated strategies is almost the same as a stag hunt because, but here we have weak here we have weak domination. So this strategy is weakly dominates this, and then the first strategy doesn't have any chance. Okay. Okay, let's look now at some games and look what are the evolutionary stable strategies of these games. We looked before at the hog-dove game, right? Dove-hog. How do you say that? Hog-dove or dove-hog? I don't know. Anyway, hog-dove. We saw there are no equilibria in strict, how do you call it, pure strategies. Yeah? Because neither hog-hog nor dove-dove is an equilibria of the game. Because these are the only symmetric equilibria. They have to be, everybody plays hog, everybody plays dove, they are not equilibria. Yeah? So there are no equilibria in pure strategies. However, there is an equilibria in mixed strategies. In this case, that is that you play dove with probability 2/3 and 1/3 plays hog. No, yeah. Okay, and then you can actually look at that. You can check that. Well, let's not go into that. So if you want to see whether a strategy or a mixed strategy is an evolutionary stable strategy, what you have to do is, so this is the basic way to do that. First you check, is this probabilistic, is this mixed strategy, is it a symmetric Nash equilibrium? If it's not symmetric, forget it. It has to be symmetric. Okay. If it's symmetric, then if it's a strict Nash equilibrium, then it's certainly an evolutionary stable strategy. Yeah? If it's not strict, that means that, well, there is another strategy that has an equal utility of playing against Q. Then it must be that, well, you play better against P than P plays against itself. So it can still be evolutionary stable. Okay. Now look at the coordination game. When we saw the dove-hog game, it doesn't have an equilibrium in pure strategies, but it does have an equilibrium in mixed strategies. Now look at the pure coordination game in the right corner. This has, of course, two equilibria in pure strategies, right? Namely, both playing R1, the first action, or both playing the second action. But we also saw that it also has a mixed equilibrium, namely, both just mixing up by 50%. Yeah? So it has three Nash equilibria. Now, what are the evolutionary stable strategies of this game? Well, suppose that you play the first action. So almost everybody plays the first action, and what would you do? You play the first action as well, obviously. Second with the second action. So these are actually evolutionary stable. Then it's if everybody plays the first action, it's always better to play the first action as well. Everybody plays the second action, okay. But now suppose that you're in a population that everybody mixes up. right? It plays half-half, right? Then what would you do? Well, it doesn't matter, right? You might as well play always the first action. So, okay, it's not a strict equilibrium, so you're here, in a sense. So this is now Q, so the mixed action, right? That's now Q. Is that an evolutionary stable strategy? Well, mixed versus a mixed one, that has an expected utility of a half. But you playing the first action against the mixed strategy also has an expected utility of a half. So it's equally good. You see that? Okay, so then you have to check. Do the mixed action, is it better against somebody who always plays the first strategy than always playing this first strategy plays against somebody else who always plays the first strategy? Right? Well, that's of course not as good, because if you were the mixed action plays against who's always playing the first strategy, this is half. But if somebody who always plays the first strategy plays against somebody else who always plays the first strategy, then you get a utility of 1. So in this case, this is actually not lower, but this is actually higher than this one. So the mixed equilibrium that both are mixing things up, right? It's a Nash equilibrium of this coordination game, but it's not an evolutionary stable strategy. Yeah? And that's the important point here, because we'll see that back in signaling games. Where we come to now. So this is the signaling game. So this is another way of describing the signaling game that we looked at before, right? So we had 3 players. We have nature, that's the middleman, and we have 2 situations. Oh yeah, so this is situation 1 and this is situation 2. But now first player, he has to say, okay, I'll play M1 or M2. First player has to play M1 or M2, and then the second player, he has to play A1 or A2. Yeah? And you have the utilities here. And we saw already, this is the description of the game. Okay, we looked at what are the Nash equilibria of this game. Well, M1, M2, A1, A2, that's an equilibrium. Right, so this was these straight lines. And then M1 means intuitively situation 1, and M2 means intuitively situation 2. But this one, so that you mix up the signals, right, that will be an equilibrium as well. It's just that the messages just get a different meaning, but who cares? But we saw, if you just look at Nash equilibria, this, for instance, is also a Nash equilibrium. And this is also a Nash equilibrium. Right? And now, in a sense, we're asking, so these are of course, yeah, these are Nash equilibria, but these are actually pooling equilibria, because here the sender always sends the same signal, and the receiver always does the same action. So here, in those cases, in different situations, a different message is sent. So intuitively, the messages do get a meaning, because they describe the situation in which the message is sent. But in this case, if in all situations you send the same message, well, the message doesn't actually get a meaning. So intuitively, in those 2 cases, the messages do get a meaning, but in this case, it doesn't, and in this case, it also doesn't. Okay. But we cannot distinguish those cases if we just look at Nash equilibria, because this is also a Nash equilibrium. Now the idea is maybe we can actually distinguish those cases in terms of evolutionary equilibria. Okay. Problem. We can only look at things from an evolutionary point of view and analyze things in terms of evolutionary stable strategy if both sender and receiver actually are doing the same kind of actions. So if it's a symmetric game. But here, well, that's not the case, because the sender, he's sending messages, and the receiver only does an action. Yes, so they're not symmetric. They have different strategies to choose between. So how are we going to solve that? Well, here's what you can do. You can say, look, actually we're looking at a bigger game. Instead of saying, right, so we have senders and we have receivers, we have now saying, no, we just have individuals, and half of the time they're a sender, and half of the time they're a receiver. So everybody must have a sender strategy and a receiver strategy. All individuals must have a sender strategy and a receiver strategy. We don't make a distinction anymore between senders and receivers. Yeah? So and how do we do that? Well, we let nature choose. So nature makes the first step, and he chooses whether you're a sender or a receiver. And then you play just the signaling game as before. Right? But because nature chooses, you must have a strategy if you're a sender, and you must have a strategy if you're a receiver. So you need more elaborate strategies. Okay, you can do that. Right? And what are your strategies then? Well, so this one says, oh, if I'm a sender, I always, so the first one. If I'm a sender, I always send, in whatever situation, message 1. And if I'm a receiver, I always do action A1. And this one, for instance, it says, oh, if I'm a sender, I'm sending message M1 in situation 1, M2 in situation S2, but I always do action A2, whatever message I get. Yeah? And it's the same. But now, if you look carefully, you see that actually it's a symmetric game, right? Everybody has the same type of strategies. Everybody is actually, so a sender has 4 strategies, if you have this very simple game, and a receiver has 4 strategies. So now individuals have 4 times 4 is 16 strategies. Okay, so now you can see for all of these strategy combinations, what are the payoffs? And yeah, it's a lot of work, but I did it for you. Right, so these are the payoffs of the game. Okay. And now you have to choose what is the best combination. Which combinations are evolutionary stable? Well, do we have to check for each one of those? Oh, but we know one thing, right? We're looking for evolutionary stable strategies. Evolutionary stable strategies, we look only at at symmetric games. Oh, and evolutionary stable strategies are always symmetric solutions. So we don't look at all the table, we only look at the diagonal. Yeah, that's the only things that we have to consider. At least, these are the only candidates. So we have only, how many candidates do we have? 16 candidates. Yeah? Because everybody has 16 strategies, and these are everybody is playing the same strategy, that's the symmetric equilibrium, so 16 possibilities. Now, some of them, of course, stand out. These are the ones that get value 1, and their communication is always successful, right? In different strategies, in different situations, different messages are sent, and different messages are interpreted in a different way, right? And here we had, so do I have this here? No. So on the one, it says, just to make sure, or the one was this, and the other was this, right? The important thing is that A1 is done. A1 is done in situation S1, and A3 is done in situation X. A2 is done in situation S2. Yeah? That's happening in those cases. Then you get always value 1, expected value 1. But you have more Nash equilibria in this game. Okay, these actually are strict Nash. You can check these are strict Nash equilibria, so they are also evolutionary stable. And these ones are actually the conventions. In this very simple game, these were the only ones that David Lewis called signaling systems, where you really have communication going on. So that's good. So we have them at least on board. But what about the other Nash equilibria? Because there are more Nash equilibria. Here we have some more Nash equilibria. Are they also evolutionary stable? Well, remember, for an equilibrium to be evolutionary stable, it has to do better than all others. Again, so it has to be at least so if they are equally good against somebody else, so it cannot be invaded. So if there's another strategy that is equally good against that particular strategy, it must do less good against itself. But actually that's not the case, because for instance, the first strategy, so here's another strategy that does equally well against the first strategy. Equally well against. But this strategy does not worse against itself than the first strategy. Yeah, so that means that the first strategy is not evolutionary stable. So over it again, the first strategy is a Nash equilibrium, but it's not evolutionary stable because there's another strategy that is equally well against the first strategy, but does not worse against itself than the first strategy does against this strategy. So that means that those red things are not evolutionary stable. So we have actually the nice result now that only the strict equilibria, and only the ones where real communication is going on, they are the ones that are evolutionary stable. Right? So it's not by magic. We let evolution go its way, and we get what Lewis actually wanted, but he didn't quite get, because he also get these pooling equilibria where you don't have any communication going on. Okay. So here's again the idea. So this was the first strategy, right? Here we have an invader. Now the idea is this invader, it does equally well against the native as the native does against itself. But if this strategy plays against itself, then actually it does better than the native does against the invader. Okay. Now, this is actually a pretty old result due to Wannerreed. It says a strategy is an evolutionary stable strategy of a Lewis signaling game if and only if it's a signaling system. Yeah, so in signaling systems are the strategy profiles in which sender and receiver perfectly communicate. They're also known as separating equilibria, meaning that in different situations a different message is sent. Okay. And so these analytic results. You can prove that, right? At least for these very simple signaling games where you have only two situations and two messages. Brian Skirms, who popularized the signaling way of thinking about evolution, or evolutionary way of thinking about signaling very much, he actually said, no, we can actually do simulations with this, with more than two situations and two messages, and also then, also in that case, you see that always the only thing that end up with simulation is these signaling systems. So almost every state in the population is driven by dynamics to one signaling system or another. The emergence, so that is, the emergence of meaning is a moral certainty. Okay, there's another. Yeah, okay, let's not go into that. Okay, so here's the important point. And what I said just before the break, So Lewis provided the kind of conventions with the meaning quantifies as conventional, but two questions, or criticisms if you want, remain. First, Lewis posited that salience allows us to coordinate the conventions, but in signaling games, where is the salience, right? Where does it come from? Well, we said, okay, it's either agreement, but of course we don't want that. It's either salience somehow, but I mean, what does that mean? Or third, it's done before, right? But I mean, we have to explain that, why it's done before. So what is salience about a connection between Latterns and the C attack, for instance? It's not always clear what salience comes from. Okay. The second problem was Lewis' account is built on higher order rationality, that game theory really needs to account for equilibria. And it explains why conventions are stable, but it requires this common knowledge and this higher order expectations. And where did he think, do we really need that, right? And where does it come from? And actually, Skirms also answers, we don't really need that. And why is that? Because, we all know that we signal, as humans, we signal about the chair and the table and so on. But actually, animals, they signal as well, right? You can look at apes, but even very simple bacteria, right? You can analyze them as having a signaling system, having signaling systems, right? And obviously for those animals, so they do that somehow. Maybe it's genetically given that they do it, but it's kind of a convention as well. But it's certainly not, you cannot really explain why that emerged or how it's become, stable by relying on higher order rationality or on common knowledge, because they really don't have that, right? So maybe for humans it makes some sense to posit this higher order rationality and common knowledge, but certainly not for animals. But they also signal. So how do you explain that? Well, now the point of this evolutionary analysis is, well, we don't need salience. Evolutionary dynamics will drive out the population to develop conventions of meaning, but it's a moral certainty. So whatever you start with, right, whatever initial distribution of strategies and playing you start out with, at the end, you always end up with one particular strategy that everybody is doing. You don't need anything fancy about salience. And about knowledge, common knowledge, no knowledge is needed. It's just playing, and you get a reward or a disreward, and then you adapt to that. That's all you need. Yeah? Okay. And here is actually a lot of about the literature. I don't want to go into that. Okay, so that's about evolution. Now, I want to say, okay, evolution is very nice. Oh, I should use this. But we don't really have to go into evolution in terms of, right, playing things genetically, right, and things. We can actually do the same, or something very similar, if we think of this dynamic process, right, that leads to this convention in terms of individual learning. So individuals just learn in a very simple way, without any rationality and so on, just in terms of reinforcement learning. And actually reinforcement learning was first, well, introduced, you might say, by Thorndike for a long time ago. Skinner used it a lot. And what's been used most is Rooij and Rooij, and Thomas is using that a lot as well. So he's my PhD student. Okay, so what is reinforcement learning? Well, it's basically, it's very simple. You have an urn with balls in it, and they contain, let's say, different types of actions. Yeah? And yeah, what you do, well, basically what you do is you have this urn, you pick one ball out of it, right? You perform, so the different balls, different colors of balls, they belong to different types of actions that you do, right? And this is not game theory, this is just learning, again, in an environment, right? With a probability, you choose that action, and you do, so you just choose an action, you play that action, and then you get a reward. And the reward might be positive, it might be negative. Yes? You receive a payoff. And then, well, if the payoff is positive, you just add more balls, depending on the payoff, to your urn of the same color. And if it's negative, well, you get a punishment, right? Less balls. And you do that all over again and all over again, right? And then you get the law of effect, actions that are followed by the satisfaction of desires, right? So if you do something that has a positive reward, they are reinforced. So they actually, oh, that's good. If you do something that helps, it's good. And you do that, and you tend to do that more often in the future, right? And in the end, although learning in the beginning is fast, learning in the end it's more slower, but in the end you will see that, well, you will typically do only one action in the end. Okay. Now, Rooij and Rooij, they said, oh, you can actually use that as well for games. So here we have, for instance, the coordination game. This is a coordination game, yeah. But now you have just two players, and they have all their own urn with balls, right? And now, okay, this is one action, and that's the other type of action. And what do you do now? Well, they both choose a ball, they play, perform the corresponding action, right? But now the utilities depend on what they're doing. They receive a payoff, both of them individually, and, well, if it's positive, so if it's positive, more balls of your color are in the urn, and if it's negative, less, so, or with a percentage, depending on your payoff, right? And then you do it again, and then you do it again. Yeah, I think I don't want to go into that. I don't want to go into that. What is important here, and that's the main important thing, is that, okay, we looked at evolutionary stable strategies before, and the evolutionary stable strategies, well, they were thought about as, okay, you do a certain strategy, but you are genetically determined to do that, right? And the next generation, these are just your children. So it's biological reproduction, right? And then you can understand the result. So evolutionary, you can understand the result of evolution in terms of, well, inheritance. Yeah, that's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it, actually via the same mechanism, is via simulation. You don't So it's not as if, okay, now you pay, you go dead, but depending on your payoff, right, you have more or less children and they pay the same strategy. No, it's just you play something and then somebody else plays the same strategy but just by imitation. So you don't, it's not as if other players only use the same strategy because they are children of you. No, because they imitate you. That's another way of thinking about it. But actually the mechanism behind that is very similar, or actually is similar. But yet a third is, so this is just social learning. You can also think about individual learning, and that's this reinforcement learning. It just says, well, everybody is individually learning something, but does it via this taking balls or his actions out of an urn, probabilistically. And then in the end, right, if everybody's doing that, everybody learns individually the same, that he always does or does not the same action. Yeah? So they're all basically different ways of thinking about evolution or the dynamics, but they all give rise to the same result. Right? So it's a very robust way. It doesn't really matter how you think of this dynamic process, you always get of the same result. Well, now what about signaling games? Well, okay, I don't want to go too much into that, but basically you can think of it in the same way. Right? It's just that, well, they both have an urn, they play their part. It's, and actually we already know that, well, this reinforcement learning, it gives rise to evolutionary stable strategies, so nothing particular happens. So that's just one way of thinking about this. Another way of thinking about this is that, well, they have separate urns for the different states they might be in, right? Because signaling games, well, first nature says, oh, you're in that state, and then you only play the game. Now you can also say, well, they have different urns for the different states, and then you do the same thing. But again, there was a result that, okay, also in this way, you basically get the same result. I don't want to go into that, really. You can change other things. I don't want to go into that. What I want to go into is this, Rousseau. So Rousseau was one of those who, well, in social contract theory says that basically, right, so how does government start? Well, it has to be agreement. And he also thought about meaning, but he has some doubts about that meaning can arise from evolution because, well, he thought of a convention arising by explicit agreement, but how can they arise at explicit agreement if they don't have a convention yet, right? But, well, and then Skirms, right, doing all this analysis, he says, I believe at this point we can conclude that the possibility of learning to signal and meaning by simple reinforcement is a reasonable and robust finding. So, right, meaning can evolve from evolution and from individual learning. Okay. Now, that was, and if you want to know more about how to use, if you want to know more about how to use this, then actually you could ask Thomas, because he worked a lot on this stuff. Okay. Now, let me see, is this the one I wanted? No. Oh shit. Now, I'm sorry. I wanted to talk now about this, the thing that Peter Ganefors talked about this morning. And I knew where I had this. Oh, wait, let me get somewhere else. No, it doesn't work. Shit. It's not this one. No. Sorry. now I can't, this is much bigger than it's normally is, so I can't really see what I'm looking for. Let me, let me go this. Okay, so now we go into looking at signaling games again from an evolutionary point of view. Now different from what we did before. So before we just said, okay, we have some states and some messages and some actions, right? And the states are just states. They have nothing to do with each other. Now you can actually do a lot more with the signaling games that I suggested until now. For instance, what you can say is that the messages, right? So what, for instance, what somebody did who was a PhD student here in Edinburgh, but he's now in Amsterdam, he said, well, maybe what you can do is that the messages, they are not just messages, completely different from one another, so like boo or ba, but the messages might actually be something similar to each other, more or less similar to each other, right? And what does the evolution come down to then about the meaning of those signals? Okay, that's one way of going. And then actually you can explain some phonological properties of the different signals. For instance, what Jelle Zuidema then proposes that, well, what you end up with is that messages, so if you have particular meanings, different meanings that you want to express, that you want to do that with messages that are as far away as possible from each other. Look far less possible, not at all at each other, because otherwise you might confuse, a receiver might confuse one message with another, right? So that's one way of thinking about adding complexity to this type of game. Another way of adding complexity is to say, no, we don't build in an extra similarity measure between the possible messages. We're actually building in a similarity measure between the possible states, right? And what is the result of that? Well, Peter Gannefors talked a little bit about that, but I will say, go into a little bit more detail with that. Okay, so the first thing I did with Gerhard Jaeger, but I talked about vagueness more with Michael Franke. Okay, so let's not go into this. We all know that. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, so we can use signaling games to explain meaning, evolution of meaning, but there are lots of challenges to remain. How can we explain specific features of natural language, for instance? Okay, so we have signaling games. Oh, we have this one. Right, so again, we have language users, interactive, so game theory is very natural to use, and he introduced signaling games, so we have a distinction between signaler and receiver. We can look at that from an evolutionary point of view, and that is actually natural because you don't need knowledge or higher order expectation to account for the conventions. Okay. Many open question remains, I said that, but one interesting question is about categorization. That's what Peter Gannefors talked about. How to account for the meaning of general terms. And for instance, you can also ask, yeah, all natural languages are vague. Can we explain that? And what is the philosophical consequence of 4D theories? Because I'm actually also a philosopher, so I'm also interested in that. Okay. So again, we have a signaling game. Well, we know what a signaling game is, so I don't have to go into that. But here's the most simple one. We said it already, right? So we have it's the basic example. We have two types of situations or types. We have two messages and we have two actions, right? And this is the utility payoff. Situation 1, action A1 is good, and action A2 is bad, and the same for T2 and A2. So what are the equilibria? Well, this is one equilibrium. This is one equilibrium. And these were the only two that were evolutionary stable. Yeah, so we also had another one that was a Nash equilibrium, where everybody does the first action, but that's not evolutionary stable. Okay, that's good. They are the only reasonable equilibria, so that's good. They're also Pareto optimal. Okay. Now, in terms of those equilibria, we also said, right, you can actually derive meaning from that. And there are different ways of thinking about meaning. And until now, it was not very important, but now it will be more important. You can think of it as the meaning. Suppose we have here a signal, right? Suppose this is the equilibrium. Then you can think of this meaning, the meaning of this message as the situation or situations in which I would send this message. That's the descriptive meaning of this message. But you can also think of it as the imperative meaning, and that is the action that I tell the receiver to do. And then the meaning is just, well, do action A1. Yeah? Two different ways of thinking about meaning. So you can think of the descriptive meaning as the situations in which a message is sent, and the imperative meaning is the action that the receiver does. Okay. Now we're going to complicate the game and adding similarity to, so we have now situation. We don't have now two situations or three situations. We have now infinitely many situations. Namely, the whole line from here to here, right, say from 0 to 1, all the real numbers, they're all situations. And they're all different. Yeah? But they're all situations, but a sender strategy is now still a function from a situation to sending a message. However, there are only three messages. Boo, ba, and blee, or in this case, but just for educational purposes, black, green, and red. Yeah? It doesn't matter. We have also infinitely many actions, right? Just like the meanings. And what is now the goal of the game is to, okay, right? So in every type of situation, a sender sends one of those three messages, and a receiver, he just picks an action, right? But basically the set of actions is the same as the set of situations the sender can be in. And his goal is to pick an action, so pick a situation, as close as possible to the situation that the speaker was in. Yeah? Okay, and we're going to show this, it should be as close as possible to where the situation was in. How is that implemented? By saying that, okay, utility depends on similarity. So it's better, so if you're there, if the sender is there, and he sends whatever message, right, then it's better to, for if the receiver does this action, than if he does this action, because this is more similar to here than this is to here. Clear? Okay. So utility is just in terms of similarity. It doesn't matter that this is a Gaussian or not. Okay. What are the equilibria? Well, so this is a very simple game with a very simple structure, but the equilibria are very interesting as well. Namely, suppose that, okay, now I also assume that the probability distribution of all the situations, they're equal, right? So all the types are equally likely. What will be the equilibrium, or actually we have three, well, you have more equilibrium now, but the equilibrium will all be the first of the following form. If the probabilities of the type of situation are equal, then the first 1/3 of the situations, you always send one message. The last third send another message, and the middle ones send yet the third message. Right? And, okay, so we have a division of this line of situations or of actions in 3, an equal division. And if the sender sends a message, for instance, black, then the receiver does the action exactly in the middle of this line where the sender sends this message black. And the same for green and for red. Yeah? So this is, okay, there are more equilibria like that. So can somebody intuitively see another equilibrium here? Remember, right? The message used is unimportant. So you just swap. So another equally good equilibrium is just that if instead of the first one is black and the second green, the first one is green and the second black. That would be the same. Yeah? That doesn't matter. The message used doesn't matter, it's just that the end result, but the end result is always the same. Okay, so what do we see is that we have many situations in which a message is sent. So now, different from the previous cases, you don't, it's not the case that only in every message in equilibrium you send exactly one, in every situation you send exactly one message. No, sorry. That every message is sent only in one situation. The same message is sent in many situations, right? But the set in situations in which the same message is sent, they're all actually, okay, so they're actually very similar to each other. So meaning that the set of situations is divided in three, so it's a partition. You divide the situations in three, but it's not just a partition. Every cell of the partition is a convex set, right? And that's exactly what Peter Gadamer's claimed that the properties are. They are convex sets. That comes out of evolution, right? Because this is the result of evolution. Okay, right? And it doesn't matter, right, if you have two messages and something like this comes out depending on the initial probability and 3 and 4 and 5. It's always, you have a partition, and the partition always ends up with convex sets. And so that's one thing. And second, at this point, it has a meaning as well, namely, that's the midpoint of the set of situations in which this message is sent. And that actually can be thought of, so this is then the descriptive meaning, and this point can be thought of as the imperative meaning, and it's actually the prototype. It can be interpreted as the prototype, so that's these black dots. Yeah? So the result is, already said by Peter Gadamer, is that, okay, Peter Gadamer, at least in his book in 2000, he said, okay, right, properties are convex sets, and that's good for economical reasons maybe, but no, and this analysis says, well, actually it comes out, it's not just for economical reasons, it just comes out necessarily from evolution. Yeah, so you can give an evolutionary motivation for why you have convex sets. Okay, there is one, philosophical interest, right? So I don't know, but is there any philosopher in here? There's no philosopher. There's a philosopher in here. Well, actually you can, so because David Lewis, Peter Gadamer says that natural properties, right? So we have many properties, but not all sets are properties. We make distinction between properties and natural properties, and they are very important, for instance, for analysis of natural laws, for induction, for meaning, to account for Putnam's paradox, for rules, and so on and so on. So every time the same kind of solution pops up, and now the idea is, hey, natural properties can actually be accounted for, not only for economical reasons, as Peter Gadamer said, but actually they just pop out from evolution. At least for simple examples like the colors, right? We didn't talk about tigers yet. It would be a little bit more difficult. But and now the idea is that, well, sets closed under complementation. Sets are closed under complementation and union, but natural properties are not, and that's what you need to solve these problems. So, okay, that's the philosophical interest. Now another thing that I worked on myself, it's vagueness. So if you look at, this is what comes out from evolution, right? Given the setup of the game, so you have a similarity structure, and in every situation you send a particular message. But what you see here is that, well, if you have categorization, well, you don't see it here, but you have actually a strict line, a strict separation between, if you have only two colors, between green and red, right? So meaning of color terms are predicted to be strict. Yeah, you have a prototype, but for the rest, right, you don't have any vagueness. And of course, natural language is full of vagueness, right? Not only for color terms, but for all types of terms. It doesn't come out of evolution, so there must be something wrong. Yeah? So what's wrong? Can we build it? So what can we build into evolution such that you get vagueness out of it? That's basically one way to proceed. Well, and that's what we tried, and this is what we tried already like 7 years ago, I think, and now more people do it in a slightly different way, but this is the first one. So, okay, so we have many equilibria, depending on how you swap the colors, and all are strict, but we cannot account for vagueness. Now, to account for vagueness, one way to account for vagueness would be, so a vague language, so, right, so a signaling equilibrium is now that sender and receiver, they play their roles, they have a certain strategy. But they all use the same strategy always. To account for, in these equilibria, they never use a strict, a mixed strategy in equilibrium. But intuitively, maybe, to account for vagueness, we want them to play a mixed strategy. However, there is a result, okay, so there is a result that rational players will never prefer a vague language over a precise one if you model vagueness in terms of mixed strategies, because there is actually a general result that with mixed strategies, things can never be evolutionarily stable in these type of games. So that's a problem. So how do we account for vagueness? Well, one way of thinking about it is, well, maybe, okay, we're looking at already from things from an evolutionary point of view, so not a lot of rationality, but still players are still going for the best action, and that's rewarded, and the less good actions are not rewarded. But maybe there's something wrong there. So Lippmann's result, that's an economist, depends on assumption still of perfect rationality. And to get rid of this and to account for vagueness, maybe we should get rid of that. There are several ways to do that, and one of the ways is actually to go for stochastic choice analysis. So normally, if you use standard decision theory, standard choice theory, what you do is you're expected to pick the action that has the highest expected utility, and only that one. Yeah. That's the best action. But now, Luce, who is a psychophysics, he's doing psychophysics, well, he knows not about measurement theory. He says, well, that's actually not how people choose. People don't choose only by maximizing their expected utility. They choose in a stochastic way. They choose the best action that has the highest expected utility most of the time. But other actions that are almost equally good, they still choose many of the times. So real people are not perfect utility maximizers. They make mistakes, they make sometimes suboptimal actions, and not just at random, but depending on how high that is in the expected utility. So high utility choices are more likely than low utility ones. So this is the one that actually we use. So we use in standard evolution. So you only pick the action that has the highest expected utility. But what you do now is that, yeah, most of the time you pick the action that has the highest expected utility, but some of the times you play actions that are still a high utility. Okay, let's try to do that. Let's implement a game, an evolution, with players who play things like that. And actually, now the lambda that actually measures the degree of rationality. So how much do you choose only the action with the highest expected utility? Okay, let's go. That's not, no, okay. Depending on this lambda, you get something like this. So what does that mean? Well, before what we had is, okay, until here only black, until here only red, and there only green, right? And this you only, so this was the descriptive meaning, and the imperative meaning, so that was the prototype, right? It was exactly 1 point. Okay, but if we relax this rationality, what you actually get is what you actually see in nature, right? How we use things. If things are very red, right, they use red. But then, well, if it becomes less clear whether it's red or black, oh, sorry, if it's very black, everybody uses black. But if it's less clear, well, you get things like this. It's like an S-curve, and thing there. So you can actually get that if you play with this rationality thing. And you also get the prototype, right? It's not going to be a point anymore. It's not going to be 1 point that this is the prototype of black. No, it's more like, these are more black than other things are black. Yeah? And that's what you see, of course, in natural language as well. So, well, maybe that's actually how things work. Do I want to go into this? No, I don't want to go into this. So this was another use of evolutionary game theory to explain specific features of natural language. Yeah, so the first part we said, okay, we can explain convention, that's just general convention in terms of evolutionary game theory. You can also play with saying, okay, you can play with the utility function and with the probability function to actually account for specific features of natural language as well. You can try to do that. That's one example. Now, I want to say something about using standard game theory to account for implicatures. Okay, let's go into that. So, I said before, we can use game theory in two ways to account for natural language. First, you can use, well, signaling games, but we're going to use that here as well. In an evolutionary point of view, then we account for conventions, but we can also use it in a rational way, right, to account for, well, pragmatic reasoning, where intuitively you need rationality. Well, okay, let me just go over that. So, communication, here we have a Lewis sender-receiver game again. I don't want to go into that. And this is what we did. So this was this was a Nash equilibrium. This is one solution, and okay, there are other solutions as well. We've done there before. Okay, now I want to say you can use signaling games as well to account for pragmatic ways of thinking about language, right? And then the idea is that we communicate because we want to influence one another. Right? I communicate with you because I want a certain action, you to do a certain action, right? I cannot do that action myself, so I have to convince you that you do that action, yeah? And the only way to do that is by sending a signal. Now, Rooij assumed that actually, that the preferences are similar. You only play language as a cooperative affair, right? And he actually brought up to account for particular pragmatic ways of thinking about language, he came up with four conversational maxims. That is, quality, speak the truth; quantity, speak the whole truth; relevance, yeah, but only what is of interest, right, because otherwise don't say it; and manner, please do so in an efficient way. That's basically Rooij's way of thinking about language. And now the idea is that, hey, maybe we can explain, so he just stipulated these rules. Maybe you can actually explain why these rules are so natural, right, via a game theoretical analysis. Well, let's see whether we can do that. Okay, so first, the idea is that, information exchange to influence the hearer. So here's the idea. You have a particular decision problem, right? So you don't know what situation you're in, but you have a probability over that. So you have a particular situation, you have a probability over those situations, and you have a certain amount of, a certain set of actions that you consider to do, and they all have a utility in the different situations. And, right, so this is your decision problem. Now suppose now that I know, you don't know what situation you're in, so you don't know what is the best action, but I know better in which situation you are than you do, right? And I have a preference for, well, if I know what situation you are in, I can actually help you, right, by sending a signal, of course. Well, and if you think of it from an economic point of view, of course, I'm only going to send you a signal, and I think that it has an influence on how you're going to act, if that is actually beneficial for me as well. Yeah? Well, so this means it involves action of speakers on hearers, so it's natural to use game theory for that. So here's just a simple example, right? Suppose that this is your decision problem, right? So you consider 3 situations, T1, T2, T2, T3, and 2 actions. And you don't know which situation you're in, they're all equally likely. And these are the utilities. What action should you choose? The one with the highest expected utility. What's the action with the highest expected utility? Well, so A1 has a negative expected utility and zero, so A2 has an expected utility of 0, so A2 you should do, yeah? If you're smart. Okay. But now suppose that I know you're in situation T2. Then I can help you by saying, hey, you're in situation T2. And then you can change your action, yeah? So I can help you. That's the idea. Of course, right? You have to believe me. But that's another thing. Actually, we'll come back to that. So you can change your action because of my assertion. That's the whole idea of communication. Okay. Maximum of quality. Quality says, say only things that are true. Why should you only say things that are true? Well, here's a very simple game, right? 2 situation, 2 action game. And this is the general setup. So the receiver, he wants to do A1 in TH, so that's the high quality situation, and he wants to do A2 in T low, yeah? Okay, so these are his preferences. Now, Crawford and Sobel, they show that actually you can only expect communication. So I can say then, okay, TH is going to be the case, right? Then you will, if I say that and you believe me, you will do action A1, yeah? But now suppose, is that the good one? Yeah, now suppose that actually TL is the case. Right? I know that TL is the case. Yes? And I say TH is the case. You will do action A1. Oh, and Y, so when X and Y are actually 0 and 1. So we don't have the same preferences. Right? Then you will do action A1, but that's actually bad for you. Right? Because you get payoff A1, and in TL you should have done A2. So I can mislead you. So suppose you always believe me, right, what I say, and act upon that, then that would be bad for you. It would be good for you if you have the same preferences. It would be bad for you if you have different preferences, if you have opposed preferences, right? Okay. Now, from a decision point of view, right, you decide what to do based on the highest expected utility. And you can say, okay, you just believe me. But if you look at it from a game theoretical perspective, then you also take into account, why does the speaker say what he actually says? Oh, because he wants to say only things that are good for him. And if he expects me to act upon, well, being naive, and if I say TH, I do automatically A1, right, that could actually be bad for me. Because if actually TL is going to be the case, then I won't believe you anymore what you say. So in general, what Crawford and Sobel about signaling games they actually show is that the only way in which in this simple case that actually communication comes out and that's credible, so that you believe what I say and act upon that, is when the preferences between speaker and hearer are aligned, are similar. Right? If they are opposed, and people know, speaker and hearer know that they are opposed, you would just don't take your word for it. For instance, if we play a zero-sum game, right? So we this head and tails, right? Suppose I tell you before the game, oh, I play head, and right, you only get a positive payoff. So but you have a completely different preferences than I. For you, it's good if we do something different. For me, it's good if we do something the same. You say, so we have the preferences are completely opposed. You say, oh, I will play head. Should I believe you? Of course not. Because if you believe me, if I believe you, I will do the action that's actually would be good. So he should only say something such that if I act upon that, it would be good for him. But if it's good for him, it's bad for me. So I should not believe you. So in general, the only thing that can be believed, that's what Crawford and Sobel say, is that those things, if the preferences are actually very similar. So this kind of explains Grice's way of thinking, of looking only at cooperative situations, because only in those cases you can expect communication going on. So in those situations, right? Suppose that these are the payoffs. Then any speaker, because any speaker will always say TH, but so suppose that you're on TL, then I would still say TH if you act upon that, but you shouldn't. So you shouldn't believe what I say. Okay. That's one way of thinking about quality. So why should you say the truth? Because otherwise you don't believe it. It's not believed. There's another way of thinking about it, and that's actually taking costs into account. And that has been used a lot in, well, biological signaling. For instance, in why, you know, peacocks, right? They have this very long tail, and it's actually very, well, not very good for them, right? Because it's clumsy and so on to walk. But the male, they still have a very long tail. Why? How could that ever happen? The idea is that, well, you signal something with a long tail. What do you signal? Oh, I have so good genes that I can survive even with this very long tail, which is very clumsy. So I signal that I have very good genes, and the woman, they jump to that. Right? So you signal by having a very costly message, by sending a very costly message. Okay. So suppose that you're in this situation where normally you don't expect communication going on, you can still, so where you don't have exactly coordination of preferences, you can still have communication if it's too costly to fake. Right? So here, for instance, in this situation, the speaker wants to say, "Oh, I'm of a high type," but suppose that sending a message being of a high type is like having this tail. Right? Only individuals who actually have a high type, who are very genetically strong, right? They can actually have this tail. If you're of a low type, you cannot do that because you don't have good genes, so they have this long tail, you will die anyway. So the idea is, well, maybe you can also count for communication if the message you send is risky, is costly, right? And there's been actually a lot of discussion in the literature whether assuming that messages can be costly makes sense for natural language. Right? Because many say, for natural language, I mean, you can say whatever you want. It's for free anyway. It's cheap talk. But some say, yeah, maybe it is costly after all. In another way, right? Maybe in terms of production costs, like the tails of the peacock. No, it's not, right? But maybe it can be in terms of social costs. So if you lie and you will be caught up, right? Then you will be punished to death. That can be a cost as well. And then maybe you can make of costly signaling after all. Okay. Relevance and matter. Can we say something about that? All right. The relevance of saying something. So here's why do we say something rather than nothing, right? So suppose that you actually say nothing, right? So we are in a situation. You face a decision problem, right? And I say nothing to you. What would you do? Well, you would do the action that is best for you. Yeah? Okay. So if I don't say anything, I'm okay, and I know that you face this decision problem. I'm okay with you doing that. Yeah? So if I say something, well, maybe, right? So I have the effort of saying something. I only do that, maybe that signals already, whatever I say, that I don't like what you're going to do in the default case. So saying something, well, I only say something if I want to do something with it. I want to have an extra advantage of that. So if you desire what is expected, then you say nothing. If you don't desire this, if you want me, or if I want you to do something else, I better say something. So you can also say this, right, in terms of, okay, if I don't do anything, you do the stereotypical action. If I don't want you to do the stereotypical action, I better say something. And actually, you can do that in terms of game theory. It's a very natural reasoning. Right, so here we have an equilibrium of a signaling game, right? It's a Nash equilibrium. say that this is a message that's costless, right? Maybe it's saying nothing. And then you do action A1. And then so it's not an equilibrium, so you don't expect me to do that. Then I still say something that's actually costly. I say something, MC. Then it's called forward reasoning. It's disputable whether it can be used, but it's interesting anyway. Then you might ask, okay, so he said something, right? So why did he say something? If you wanted me to do A1, why did he say it? So hey, he must have had a good reason to say it. So that is, he wanted me to do action A2. And that is because we're actually in situation T2. So saying something means something. Okay. And actually, in this way, you might want to explain manner implicatures. So the idea is that John killed the sheriff and John caused the sheriff to die. Well, many say it actually have the same meaning, right? What could be the difference in meaning? Still, my intuition is, and many people's intuition is that, well, if John killed somebody, he did it in the stereotypical way, right? With a pistol or with a knife. But if I say, John caused the sheriff to die, right? That's not with a pistol or a knife, that's with poisoning him. Right? I don't know whether you share the intuition, right? But that's not the most stereotypical way of killing the sheriff. And now the idea is, hey, John killed the sheriff, that's a short way of expressing this. And if you express the same thing in a more complex way, you have an extra effort. So probably the meaning of that, or the pragmatic meaning of that, is not the stereotypical way of killing, but the less stereotypical way, by poisoning. Does it make sense? Okay. That's actually called Horn's division of pragmatic labor, and people have accounted for that in terms of bidirectional optimality theory, but you might also use, you can do different ways, but one way of doing that is in terms of forward induction. Quantity implicatures. Now, let's go into best response dynamics. The last thing is best response dynamics. Okay. Actually, I, together with Anton Mender, came up with something like this, but only a limited version of that. And Gerhard Jaeger and Michael Franke, they extended it to really have a best response dynamic. But okay, let's see how it goes. So here's the idea. It's again a signaling game, and now these are the messages. So we all know, right? Scalar implicatures. Do we all know scalar implicatures? If you say A or B, you mean, not the case at A and B. Yeah, do we all know that? Do I hear yes? If you say A or B, it's not the case at A and B. Yeah? Okay. So here's a simple way of analyzing that. It makes a lot of assumptions, but still. Suppose we have two messages, A or B and A and B. Right? And we have three situations in which this could be used. Namely, situation where A is the case but not B, or B is the case but not A, and the case where A and B are the case. Yeah? Okay. Now, the first row now says, okay, in which types of situations is A or B true? Well, in all three situations A or B true, they're all equally likely. Yeah? All probability of 1/3. In which situation is A and B true? It's only here true. Yeah? Okay. So you have a message, and they have a semantic meaning, and this is the probability that these are the corresponding probabilities. Now, you're looking at things from a speaker perspective. Right, so first it was from a hearer perspective. We said A or B, what could be the case? All three, all consistent with the meaning of A or B. A and B, what could be the case? Only the third situation. That's from the hearer's perspective. Now from the speaker's perspective, suppose that you're in one situation, right? Which message should you send? Well, if you're in situation A and B, and that's now the dot, you should use, of course, A or B, if you have to choose between those two. If you're in situation B and not A, well, you have to use A or B. But if you're in situation A and B, you should, of course, use A and B. Yeah? Okay. So that's the speaker's perspective. So that is, you get, so if you're here, yes, so if you're here, you do this, then you send this, and if you're here, you send this, and if you're there, you send this, with probability 1. Okay? So now we look at, and then the hearer again. If he hears A or B, well, these are both possible, but this one is not possible anymore, because if you're in this situation, he should have sent not A or B, but A and B, right? But those two are still possible, so they both have a probability half. But in this situation, you will send A and B, so that's the only one. So what you get is that if you say A or B, well, you're in one of those situations, but not in that situation because of optimization. And which one that is, it's up for grabs. Okay. So that's very nice. And that's, so what you do here, and it's called iterated best response, right? You look first at, here, so you look first at the semantic meaning of a message. You look at that from a hearer's point of view. Then you look at what is, given the semantic meaning of the message, what should the speaker do? Given what you expect that the speaker does, what do you expect that the hearer does? And given that you expect what the hearer does, what should the speaker do again? And then at one point, right, things don't change anymore. And then you have, and then you say that's the semantic meaning. Okay, that's very nice, and it works for some conversational implicatures. For instance, John or Mary came, that means that not both. John ate some of the cookies, not all. But it actually goes wrong for free choice permissions. I don't want to go into that now because it's time. But then Michael Franke and Gerhard Jaeger, they actually extended this best response dynamics such that they can also account for these free choice permissions. So if you say you may do A or B, that it actually means you may do A and you may do B, which is quite a problematic in standard pragmatics, but they can account for that. Okay, that's it. So I hope to have shown you some useful things about signaling games. Okay, thank you.